Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, December 10th, 2024, and Colonel Wilkerson is back with us. Welcome back, Larry.
Good to be back with you, Nima.
Larry, let's start with what has happened in Syria, which is of paramount importance right now for the axis of resistance. How do you find right now the axis of resistance? Are they going to be defeated as Bashar al Assad was defeated in Syria?
I think they've taken a blow, but I don't think it's the serious blow that some are saying. And I think Iran is already dealing with it in a very level headed, circumspect way. They had already opened, I'm told, and pretty good sources, they had already opened some preliminary talks with probably through Oman, but could have been through Qatar, could have been through Egypt. I don't know. I can't pin that down, but they'd already opened some talks with what you might call a forward team for Donald Trump about negotiations on a new agreement. The I think the impetus for this was the new president and maybe Zarif probably too, and others. But so what they've got now is a situation where that is the strategic alternative remaining to them that makes some sense, especially if this plays out the way some are saying it's going to play out. Now, I don't for a moment know that it's going to play out because let's face it, this individual who's in charge in Damascus now is anybody's guess. I mean, let's just face what he's been leading. He's been leading the people at our beck and call, mind you, and Israel's and Britain's. And apparently, since Erdogan decided to violate the agreement he made with Putin in Astana, we paid them, we offered him billions of dollars to help his economy get back in some kind of decent shape. And I want to say to him, you know what we did to Turkey in 1990-91, right after the Gulf War, and the Congress wouldn't approve the billions we promised you? Stand by for the same thing. But he wanted to do it anyway because of the Kurds and because of the almost 3 million Syrian refugees in his country. But back to the points, um, I think this president wants to negotiate. And I think he wants to negotiate because he wants to get the sanctions lifted. And he knows that's the only way to do it effectively and without any repercussions to speak of. So this gives him even more impetus to do it. He's lost Hezbollah for all practical purposes, or I should say, Hezbollah has lost Iran. And he's lost the conduit to them, the line of communications, line of support. Hezbollah has to be really frantic right now. I would imagine because how are they going to find a new sugar daddy and a way to get to them? I wouldn't be surprised if we saw either a complete folding of Hezbollah's flag, so to speak, or, and this might be more likely, a last ditch battle against Israel to take as many of them down as they possibly can. And I'm sure Netanyahu is really concerned about that being a possibility. He's running into Syria. Now, I'm told the Israeli tanks are on the outskirts of Damascus right now. So, yeah, the axis of resistance, such as it was, is probably ruptured. But Iran has other options. And frankly, I think for them and for people like Zarif and others whom I have some respect for, it's a better option. Um, and maybe this was a turn of events that might prove beneficial to Iran rather than harmful. You never know with the empire on their back. But that's the way I'd like to look at it. And Donald Trump's a mercurial character in this regard too. So who knows what he might do? He's got two arts of the deal to do, one in Ukraine and one with regard to Iran. One wonders if he's even capable with the people he's put in his cabinet, apparently, of doing two simultaneously or near simultaneously. So I mean, that's a rambling answer, but I think Hayat Tahrir al Sham and Abu Muhammad al Jolani, I guess it is, who's leading it, are a big question mark right now. I don't think anyone knows where they're going. I listened to Lavrov, and Lavrov was pretty clear about who he thought was behind it: Israel, the United States, and Britain. He's absolutely right. We didn't think that it would happen this fast and in this blitzkrieg fashion. But what we've been doing in the United States ever since my president, George W. Bush, turned to George Tenet after we couldn't go on from Iraq and take Bashar al Assad down, we thought it'd just be a cakewalk. After we couldn't do that because of the insurgency in Iraq, he turned to George Tenet, and he didn't need a presidential finding. They didn't want to archive it. He told Tenet, get rid of Assad. And we've been trying to do it ever since. Obama made it official with a presidential finding in 2015, as I recall. But we've been trying to get rid of Assad ever since then. And we will ally with anybody, even the people who brought down the towers and killed people on videos. You know, that's what we've done. And look at what we're doing with the Kurds again. Oh my God. We made a deal with Turkey. Turkey wants to eliminate the Kurds as much as possible. They see the PYD as the same way they see the PKK. And they also want to get those refugees back into Syria, which I understand today they were already streaming back into Syria. Yep, Iran has been checked, if you will, in one respect, but I think it could be a positive for them if they take advantage of it.
How about the situation for Palestinians, for Gazans, for the people in the West Bank? Because we know all of these attempts on the part of Iran to help Hezbollah was because of the situation in Palestine, in
Yes.
Gaza, in the West Bank. What would happen to them, in your opinion?
Netanyahu's got his wish here in the immediate time frame. He's got the focus off Lebanon and he's got the focus off Gaza. The focus is on Syria now, and that's what he wants. He doesn't want people watching him brutally slaughter men, women, and children in Gaza. I read a piece this morning. My daughter sent it to me. I had not seen it. It's about this group that is forming amongst the 465,000 or so reservists in Israel. It's small right now, but it's growing every day, and they're fed up. They're fed up with the war. They're fed up with the methodologies of the war, particularly in Gaza. And so you've got 600 or 700 of them now, and it's growing every day. And they're fed up also with the fact that they think Bibi Netanyahu doesn't give a tinker's damn about the hostages, and that's really got some of them worried. But they're not showing up for duty. They're not answering the call. They're not going back for a second tour, or in some cases a third tour. So he's got the focus off of that now with Syria, and look what he's doing in Syria. I had an argument with a Jewish gentleman this morning. Oh no, he's not going to go any further than just a little buffer zone, right? Ben Gvir and Smotrich are back there planning on settlements in Golan and beyond. I know they are. I just know they are. It takes the focus off Gaza, and that's bad because we needed to hammer that focus until somebody had the guts, the courage to put Netanyahu in chains.
Please don't scroll past just this once in your life.
How did you find the fall of government in Syria? Iranians are talking about that Turkey has betrayed them. Russians are talking the same way.
Yeah.
And what was, Larry, your take on what Turkey has been doing and has done in Syria?
Well, it was that huge bribe. I'm told it was $4 or $5 billion first installment. And, you know, inflation's terrible in Turkey right now. And if he wants his foreign minister to take over, he's got to do something to improve the economy. I think Turkey had a choice to make. Again, you know, which way do I go? Do I go to Moscow? They didn't offer me much money. What I really want to do is get these Syrians out of my country, and I want to take care of the Kurds once and for all, and maybe get myself a little buffer space in Syria, like Netanyahu says he's getting, but I think Erdogan really means that. Buffer space alone. I don't think he wants any more of Syria. And so he went with the U.S., Britain, Israeli. I'm also told the Israelis promised him money, and I wanted, you know, where are the Israelis going to get? Oh, they're going to get it from Sugar Daddy. That's where. So we'll be giving money, if we give any, to Erdogan, and we'll be giving Israel share too. Maybe Israel meant something else other than money. But I understand the deal was quite luxurious for Erdogan. So we bought him. You know, I'm sure he wouldn't like that epithet, but I think we bought him like a whore. We bought him. I think Lavrov might have said something like that in Doha if he'd really been pressed. When he's in English, he speaks English very well, but he has to search like I do in French for for words sometimes, and it's not quite as fluid as it is in Russian, I suspect. But he summed it up, I think, pretty much, and he also summed up the other situation when he was asked about um, Ukraine. He kind of started off by saying, "Remember Admiral Buchanan and his remarks." Rear Admiral Buchanan, speaking for the U.S. Strategic Command, he said, a very serious mistake. That was what he said in English. And then he went on to say, to speak about a limited nuclear war is an invitation to disaster. And of course, he's absolutely right there. But we're looking at this chain of war, proxy war for the most part, running all the way from actually from Belarusia all the way down through Ukraine and down into the Levant and down to Chabahar and Bandar Abbas. That's where the conflict is impacting people in a major way, all along there, for different reasons, but nonetheless, the empire is central to it. The empire is central to it, and its clean break strategy is central to it, because the clean break strategy says chaos. Let's foment chaos all along that line. Let's have chaos. That's what Nord Stream 2 was all about. Chaos. Let's have chaos, because into chaos, only the empire can come and fix things. That's what we've done.
How is it going to, when you look at the long-term strategy on the part of Turkey right now, are they gonna, it seems right now that Turkey and together with Israel, Netanyahu, they're so happy with the situation. But is it going to be the case for them in considering in a long run?
I told my daughter this morning, to whom I confide my most intimate truths. I said, if you liked Libya, look at Syria over the next year. I mean, no one's going to control this. Not Jelani, not Iran, not Russia. Although Jelani has said something about maybe declaring an Alawite autonomous zone, and that's where the Russian base is, naval and the air base. But to show you the Russians' concern, they sortied their naval fleet into the Mediterranean, not knowing what was going to happen to it. I mean, Israel was just as apt to go over there and bomb the ships. Israel was bombing everything, and still it's bombing everything in Syria. Anything that might look like it could be used as a weapon, they're bombing. And that's not just because they want to make sure Hezbollah can't pick up any pieces. That's because I think they have other aspirations for Syria. I've always thought that. Always thought that. I've always looked at that highway to Damascus and looked at how fast an Israeli armored division could be there. And if it were a clean slate and they weren't embroiled in Lebanon and in Gaza, they'd go right away. They'd take the whole damn region. That's what they want to do ultimately anyway. If I were the king in Amman, I'd be really counting my days, because they want that too. And they want the water and the resources associated with it. It is not settled at all, is what I'm trying to say, and it's going to be a mess. If you think Libya is a mess right now, and it surely is, Syria is going to be worse.
Was Turkey cooperating with the United States and Israel behind the scene before this happening in Syria? Because right after the ceasefire, Larry, this is so important. What was the reason that right after the ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel, this attack has happened in Syria?
Yep.
Who's behind that? Who's the mastermind of this? Is Netanyahu?
I think the mastermind is in Washington, and I don't use mastermind loosely. I think the mastermind is more the intelligence community of MI6, CIA, and Mossad than it is Biden or Blinken or Sullivan although I can see Jake's hand in this. But I think it's probably the intelligence agencies who've been running this all along anyway. They're the ones who have been shooting at American soldiers, for example, in Syria, because the American soldiers thought they were supposed to be shooting at ISIS and did. And what they were shooting at was CIA agents running ISIS. So, I mean, this is crazy. I mean, and we've still got those U.S. forces over there in that sector. It's just so confused that I don't think, unless Bill Burns is personally briefing the president, I don't think probably the national command authorities, we used to call them, the Secretary of Defense, the President, Secretary of State, I don't think they probably have a clear picture on it either. I think the intelligence community thinks they might have a clear picture, but I doubt if they do. And if Bill's doing anything at all, he's probably telling Biden, if he's telling Biden anything, probably talking to Blinken, that HTS and AMJ, I'm calling Solani AMJ, um, are just as apt to do something that's in our disinterest tomorrow morning as they are to do something that's in our interest. So I don't know how they deal with it other than day by day, hour by hour. It's not a positive for us in the sense that positive that Assad is gone. Okay, I'll give you that. And I've been shocked, Nima. I've got people on the ground in Aleppo, Erbil, a couple of other places, and they've sent me hundreds of videos of people coming out of jails 50 feet underground where they haven't seen the sunlight in 15 years. They're coming out and they're stunned. They can't believe that they're out in the sunlight again. They can't believe that they're getting a meal. They can't believe that they're not being horsewhipped or raped or plundered in some way. It was horrible. And I have a hard time thinking about that optometrist, Bashar al Assad, knowing that this kind of thing was going on. Yeah, I suppose he did, but you want to say, well, like Saddam Hussein didn't know what Uday and Qusay were doing all the time, didn't know what all the others were doing. Well, most of the records show that Saddam Hussein did know a lot about what was going on and condoned it. But this is as bad as anything that other leaders of that type have done in the world before. If what I'm seeing, if those videos I'm seeing are accurate videos, it's horrible. The prisoners that were kept in the dark, in the dank, and underground, and for years.
30 seconds to launch of A-18 Pro. Give me a go, no go.
In that sense, it is positive for the Syrian population, but I fear what's going to follow. I'm sure there was some of that in Gaddafi's Libya, and I know there was a lot of that in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and there was quite a bit of it in Afghanistan when we first got there. But look at what they are now. At best, Iraq is a basket case looking for a place to collapse. Only thing about Iraq that's a success right now, and this is Gary Vogler and his boys and what they did in Iraq for us when they were there, is the oil industry. It is finally coming back to where it's not pumping what its capacity is, but it's to the point where they're actually generating some revenue. And here's another one, Nima. That's China's oil. That's a big part of China's oil, and so Iran knows that. And if I were Iran, I would be playing that knowledge and that surety in terms of ensuring China that the straits will be open for them, much the way the Red Sea could be open for China or seems to be open for China and only closed for those who are supporting Gaza and supporting Israel. And I would play that in high strategy too. I would make sure. I think it's 20% of China's oil that comes. It's no middling amount that comes from the strait. and most of that's Iraq oil, Saudi oil, and Iraq oil. But I understand Iraq is selling almost all of its to China. Isn't that something? We went to war in Iraq so China could get oil. That's how things go in the world. Yeah. Best laid plans of mice and men often go astray.
Why has Bashar al-Assad decided not to fight for his government, for his country, and he just left the power without fighting, with an army to be 200,000 soldiers?
They
They
weren't
handed
paid.
over.
They weren't paid. They weren't fed. They had to scrabble to keep their families alive. It was terrible. Morale was rock bottom when it came time to take the bombs. And let's face it, they were being bombed by Israel. They were being bombed by the United States from the air. They had no significant air force to put up against those kind of assets. So they were being artillery. They were being bombed from the air by at least two different nations. I don't know that Turkey put any air power in there. I hadn't heard that they did, but I know we did, and I know the Israelis did. And it was a classic collapse, really, when you think about all the things that went into it. Lowered morale, not a feeling not of fighting for your country, but a feeling of I need to get out of here or I'm going to get killed. And many of them, of course, did get killed. Demoralized completely.
But it's so amazing that you see you don't see any sort of resistance coming from this army. Do you think they were that much weak? They were that much damaged by the
That's
government? Because at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of resistance. But
that's what happens when you go years on with the kind of conditions that they were exposed to, the kind of conditions that I was told that they might have, let's say you were a lieutenant equivalent in the Syrian regular forces and you were making the equivalent of $200 US 3 years ago, you're now making about 30 and you're expected to survive on that. And that's all you're making and all you're going to make. You have no prospects, not really. And if you have a family, you darn sure have no prospects. You're out in the street scrubbling around for food, and you're supposed to defend the country with your life. It's really hard to keep a military together when you do that sort of thing to them. Did Assad know how bad the conditions were? I doubt it. Again, optometrist. I don't think he really knew what he was doing about half the time. Now, that's being very kind to him. But I think his Alawite commanders were the ones who, as it happens in the United States, who told him what was going on and asked his decisions in ways that his decisions were foreclosed before they asked for them. You know what I mean? This is how bad it is. And you can do this or you can do this, but if you do this, it'll get worse. You know, okay, I'll do that. I don't know that because I don't know anything about their chain of command and how it worked. I do know a little bit about how the forces have participated with us in the first Gulf War, 1990-91, because the Syrians participated with us. Oh, how far we have fallen, right? And I think I've told you this before. Bashar al-Assad was one, and his people were one of the most helpful after 9/11 in terms of identifying Al Qaeda to us, where they were and what they were doing. He was trying to buy into the good graces of the empire, I'm sure. But we quickly turned on him, just like we turned on Gaddafi. One minute Gaddafi's having lunch with Americans in Tripoli, and the next minute we came, we saw, he died. You know, Hillary Clinton. That's the way the empire operates now. Putin said it clearly. Don't anybody trust the United States of America? They're duplicitous. They lie. They cheat. They steal. They'll sneak up on your back and cut your throat. That's the way Putin looks at us. That's the way Lavrov looks at us. And I don't blame them one bit.
This is what losing 15 kilograms with walking looks like. 4 months ago, I started walking for...
seems that Iran and Russia would they're going to sign that comprehensive agreement between the two countries by January 25th. How this situation in Syria going to influence the relationship between Iran and Russia, in your opinion?
If AMJ Jelani, if he does what he hinted at in Damascus yesterday, I guess maybe day before yesterday, no, yesterday I think it was. If he allows the Russians to stay in what will eventually be an autonomous Alawite zone, and therefore doesn't take any more action, punitive action against the Alawites, then I'm not sure that Putin would do this. But if he doesn't allow that, if Russia winds up having to close its naval base, only one it's got in the Mediterranean, and it has to remove its air base, why not relocate to Iran under the Defense Pact? Why not relocate? That's what I'd do if I were Putin. I'd relocate to Iran. And if I were the Iranians, I'd allow that to happen if it didn't foreclose the negotiations. If it forecloses the negotiations, I'd wait. I'd wait and see if I got a deal and if it was a good deal. And then I'd make my mind up about the Russians. But if I can't get negotiations, and I do get negotiations and I get a bad deal and I don't want to sign it, then I'd do it. I'd invite the Russians in to not just to have an air base, but also to have a naval base. Russians have been looking since the beginning of the Russian Empire, hundreds of years ago, for a warm water port on the Persian Gulf. They never really achieved one. They could achieve one with this. Look what the empire in the world today, the American empire, will have caused if that happens. For the first time, the Russian empire, such as it is, will have a port, a warm water port on the Indian Ocean at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Whew, that won't sit well with Washington. Putin, are you listening?
Iranians are talking about that they can provide Hezbollah with weapons. They have their alternatives to do that. Can you understand what are their alternatives?
The only alternatives I can see are air, and that would be very fraught with problems because the Israelis wouldn't hesitate to shoot the transport planes down, even if they were wearing civilian garb. I mean, Mossad is good enough to pick out 3 out of 6, and they wouldn't care if they shot down 3 civilian airliners. Or ship, and ship would be a little bit safer, but still be dicey, because the Israelis really have a fairly efficient naval service in terms of ship inspections and running people down in the Mediterranean or wherever it happens to be. So I don't know, unless you could talk someone else in Central Asia into becoming a conduit for you, and let's just take Uzbekistan or someone like that. And I don't think Uzbekistan would do it, but if you could entice them with money or whatever, then you'd have a torturous route. So geography becomes your enemy in this case. I'm not saying it wouldn't be possible. Look, they're supplying the Houthis in Yemen, and they're doing that apparently around a fairly aggressive U.S. naval. I won't call it a blockade, but it is a quarantine-like thing where they stop periodically ships and search them and such. So, but they're getting supplies into the Houthis. So it's not impossible if you're ingenious enough and you have the equipment and the transport mechanisms and the people who can in effect do it. But it'd be hard. It would be hard, and the Israelis would just be after it all the time.
If Iran can get these weapons to Hezbollah, to Lebanon. And Turkey is just caring about their interests. They're not caring about what's going on in Gaza. So far, we haven't seen anything, any positive movement on their part. Who's gonna? Saudi Arabia, UAE, they don't care about what's going on in Gaza. Egypt is too weak to do anything. The government is in Jordan is corrupt. They're not gonna do anything for Gazans,
And
for
and
Palestinians.
Jordan's just hanging on the udder of the U.S. cow, you know.
And that's why I think the future of Palestinians right now with Donald Trump in Washington, who's willing to give the West Bank, Gaza all together to Israel.
Hell, he'll hand half of Syria to them. He'll say, "Go ahead. Why don't you develop a Trump hotel right over there, just outside Damascus?" That'll be Trump with respect to Netanyahu and whoever replaces Netanyahu. Netanyahu's in real deep internal trouble right now. I'm going to be very surprised if he survives for another month. Now, I know he's a magician, but he has got some people in Israel who are as bloodthirsty as he, really angry at him. And it's going to be. I was watching his body language yesterday, I guess, just a few minutes of video, but he's just one walking pissed off guy now, and he's got so many people who are after him, and not just the attorney general, but I mean now he's got Gallant coming out and revealing things about him and about their relationship and such. And I think the killer for him right now is that no one, and this is a big thing behind that movement I was telling you about amongst the reservists, no one thinks he's interested one whit in the hostages. Now, how could he change that? Get a deal. What was it I saw this morning? 225 were taken hostage. 97 of them are still unaccounted for, allegedly held by Hamas or Hamas people. Half of them are estimated by Mossad to still be alive. So that's maybe 50 that are still alive. That's not a lot. It's certainly not the 225 who went originally, but if he could get some of those back, the euphoria associated with that might attenuate some of these problems he's got. But he's got to do that, and he's got to do it fairly swiftly.
Larry, how do you see the situation in Syria and what's going on in the West Asia, in the Middle East, playing out for Russia in terms of the conflict in Ukraine? Because Donald Trump recently, he tweeted that Russia lost in Syria and they've lost 600,000 soldiers killed and wounded in Ukraine. On the other hand, on the part of Ukrainians, the number is 400,000. This is a totally distorted picture he's giving us. And
it's got to be the lies coming from our intelligence community. If he's getting briefings, and I assume he is, usually the president-elect does, and he's getting lies from the intelligence community. Those are outlandishly off figures. But I would say to Donald Trump, if those were legitimate figures, I would say to Donald Trump, do you know how many Russians died in World War II? 20 freaking million. Do you know how many people Ukraine had when this war started? Do you know how many people they have now? Do you know how many people Ukraine has probably lost on the front lines? How many it lost yesterday, last minute, in the next minute, in the next 10 minutes? Do you know? Have you any idea? So what is this preposterous crap about Russia taking all these casualties, even if they have? It's mathematically impossible for Ukraine to sustain itself. Donald, don't you do math?
Georgia, no problem for Russia.
God, this
Is it
woman,
getting out of the hand for
yeah,
Russia?
this woman is something else. I was trying to get the proper pronunciation this morning because I didn't know Salome that well. I'd heard her a couple of times before, but someone told me my confusion is caused by the fact that she's French and Georgian. So, thus her affinity for the EU, I don't know. But they said they say it in Tbilisi, Salome Surabichvili. And she is out there saying she's not leaving. And I'm sure she is on the CIA's payroll big time. She's not leaving. It's an illegitimate parliament because the election, certified by independent observers as being free and fair, was false. And so the parliament can't appoint a new president or whatever, however they do it in Georgia. And so she's causing enormous problems, and we're just salivating in those problems because we want Georgia to have a political party that will open a second or third now front against Russia. We don't want Georgia to be anything but our pawn in this business of proxying Putin into hell. And she's the agent for it now. And she says she will not leave the presidency. Now, the presidency in Georgia is just a ceremonial thing, but it's a problem. It's a huge problem. And it says, in some respects, that we have at least achieved an amount of turmoil that will catch Putin's attention and cause him to focus on yet another theater.
Do you think that the Trump administration right now is thinking of the continuation of the conflict? Because the way that the Biden administration is talking $1 billion again sending to Ukraine, and we don't hear anything but this distorted picture from Donald Trump. He doesn't talk about what's going on, what's really going on in Ukraine. What's in his mind right now, in your opinion, and the administration to come?
I couldn't even begin to guess, Nima. Trump is so all over the map with his remarks, and his body language in front of Notre Dame Cathedral was confusing too, especially vis-a-vis some of the other people he met, who are people he's going to need in the future to be able to talk to and deal with, not least of which Macron. And France's government's falling apart. Germany's government's falling apart. I don't know how much longer this money that the Europeans are offering, for example, is flying in the face of their needs and of their people's needs. You know, we're looking at, I was talking with two economists the other day who were giving me this.
Okay, this is the Automatic Course Creator. And if you are looking for the fastest and most
And I think I picked up that one of the things they were angling at was that we're looking at the Europeans because of a number of things. One, some of them's plussing up their contributions to NATO per Trump's wishes and doing it even more so now because they want to kind of, preempt Trump. And the things, the money, the amount of money and arms they've provided to Ukraine, the amount of money and arms they promised further to provide to Ukraine, is going to kill the luxurious social systems that Europe has developed over the past 40 years or so that have made Europe the envy of the world, whether it's healthcare or their revenue systems or whatever. They are, that, what is it they say about Denmark? It's the happiest people in the world. The people there are happier than anybody. That's going away if they keep on this angle, if they keep on this direction. So they got to be, their publics have got to be thinking, as I've said before, about new leadership. That's going to complicate things majorly. I don't think it's going to come about in time for Trump to use whatever change there is and is very adverse to the Ukraine war and continued participation in it, monetarily or otherwise. But it's going to be a momentum that's building in that regard. If he's smart, and every day I ask myself, is he really smart? Is he just a grifter or is he really smart? Then he'll take advantage of that and he'll shut this down. Not only will he shut it down, he'll shut down NATO like he's intimated he was going to do, but it, doesn't have the courage to do. Shut down NATO, make the Europeans work on their own security and their own security identity and apparatus, help them, maybe back them up with the U.S. nuclear shield, added to Britain's and France's, and get out of this mess in Ukraine and start working with the Russians to bring them back into Europe and to make Europe whole and free again, and to cut off any tendency that the Germans or the French or others might have to go their own separate ways. That'd be a monumental task, but it'd be a great task to get started and to begin to put the foundations down for. Because NATO's not going to endure. Lavrov was talking, and so was Wang Yi, about the disastrous policy of not only doing Ukraine, maybe doing Georgia, maybe doing other nations that border on Russia, although I can't think of any others they'd have any leeway with at all. And doing all of this in order to gear NATO up to take on China. Wang Yi's no fool. Xi Jinping's no fool. They know that this language about the real enemy is China and we need NATO to take on China is putting them in a trick bag at best. Why do they want to fight China? Why do they want to fight China when China is the greatest positive economic power in the world right now? And inevitably, the power is swinging. It's swinging. It's swinging from the west back to the east, where it was for so long, 3,000 years. And we're fighting that. We're fighting that tooth and nail. And now we want the Europeans to help us fight it. This isn't going to work. This is not going to work. I think it's going to wind up being an absolute disaster for the empire. And Europe's going to get, if it goes along with this any longer or much longer, it's going to get caught in the middle. It's like the Koreans. Why should we want to host a military force on our peninsula that is more focused on fighting our major trade partner than it is on fighting the people who might come across that border and really do harm to us? If you're a South Korean and you're under 40, you think about these sorts of things. Why would we want to keep this army on our peninsula other than our own security? And oh, by the way, our leaders now tell us, the ROC military will tell you any time you want to talk to them, that they can handle North Korea by themselves. The only thing they're worried about is the nuclear weapons, of course. And if we provided our shield, they're worried though. The generals amongst them are worried that if we don't have troops on the ground in Korea, we won't provide them that shield. We'll say we will, but when it comes down to it, we won't. And I don't have an argument for that with them, other than the diplomatic argument. But of course we will. We'll give you our word. Our word doesn't mean much anymore. So I understand the angst of the South Koreans.
Gary, the situation in the European countries, considering what's going on in Ukraine and right now in Syria, I think the situation would worsen considering the immigrants going to Europe. Do you think that are they gonna make some sort of move on their part? Because the new government, the new people, these people, jihadists, takfiris, whatever they call it, Giuliani and Zelensky, the new Zelensky for Syria, it seems they came out of the same factory.
Yeah. Well,
how are they going to influence the situation in the European countries? And because right now I don't see these Syrian immigrants getting back to Syria. We may see more immigrants coming to Europe.
we may, but it depends on what happens in Syria. if Syria gets its act together, I know that's a big if, it could be a magnet for people coming back. Uh, of the people in the world in diaspora of some sort of another, the Syrians seem to me, the ones I've met and talked with, they seem to be more eager and anxious to get home under whatever circumstances, as long as they didn't their throat being cut, than any other diaspora people. More so than the Iraqis. Iraqis, for example, in this country, go home. Are you shitting me? I'm staying here. I've got a good job. I'm staying here. So I don't know. I think it all depends on what happens in Syria, but I don't have high hopes for what happens in Syria because too many people playing in it, too many people mixing up that pie.
Transformasi Bank Simpanan Nasional.
Well, one guy described it this way. I don't remember who. It might have been Alistair Crook, but he said it's like a billiard table, you know, and there's all kinds of people walking around the billiard table with cues going bang, bang, and the balls are going boom, bing, you know, all over the place. That's pretty much that's a good metaphor for it.
I do believe that the future of Syria would be even darker than what we're witnessing in Libya, because there are many interests, Israeli interests, Turkish interests. These people, these ISIS, the new face of ISIS in Syria.
Yeah.
These are
Well,
they're gonna destroy Syria.
Alarcon once told me, then the president of the Cuban National Assembly, our problem is we are so far from God and so close to the United States. Well, Libya had that sort of situation only peripherally. You know, you could say so far from Italy or whatever. Syria has got everybody, all the big dudes around it. Even the little pipsqueak Israel is very powerful when it's got its big daddy behind it. And you've got Iran, no insignificant power either. And you've got Turkey, now a questionable entity in the strategic calculations of the world. Wither Turkey. What's Turkey going to do on any given day at any given moment? A lot of power there. And incredibly, hasn't been battle hardened or battle tested in a long time in a really serious way, but it's got a formidable land army and fairly formidable other armaments too. So I wouldn't want to be in Syria's position. And I haven't even mentioned Iraq. Iraq is probably going to see what it can do in Syria too. We haven't even talked about them. You know, they had the militias all ready to go, and I understand some of them actually crossed the border. I don't know if the Baghdad's called them all back. I don't even know if Baghdad controls them. So, yeah, Syria's in an untenable place in many respects, especially with the empire wanting everybody to be in chaos. That's why we did the Arab Spring. That's why we blessed the Arab Spring. It was all about democracy and everything. No, we knew it would result in chaos. Condi Rice went and gave her famous speech about the Middle East, North Africa, coined that term MENA, you know, and said we've made mistakes in the past. And Obama gave his speech later about we've made mistakes in the past and we need to understand the mistakes we've made and we need to help these people. That's all bullshit. It's all cover for the empire's reasserting hegemony through causing chaos. We knew damn well that those Arab Springs would result in chaos.
Larry, the case for Palestine. The Arab states, the Arab League, were talking about putting Palestine in that agreement between the Arab states and Israel, that the Palestinian state would be one of the main issues for them, and to be on that agreement between the two parties. Right now, do you think that would weaken their position, or they're going to change their mind toward Palestine?
It all depends on Riyadh and other Arab capitals. And with that dependence being noted, I think a Palestinian state is dead. The Abraham Accords will come back. And that's Netanyahu's fondest wish too, that they come back and that they hide everything he's done and make his life with the Arabs palatable, at least until he turns on them and tries to take their territory.
Yeah, I don't. I think at this particular moment, you see that the chaos that is happening right now in Syria is not at the border of Iran, is in Syria. It's
Yep.
close to Lebanon. Lebanon is gonna have a very difficult future with Syria being this way. And
I
the
would say
Palestine,
Lebanon may have no state future. You know, I said Israel didn't have a state future, and it doesn't, not as a liberal democracy. It's going to be an apartheid, power maintained state with Zionists in charge. Lebanon, I think, may be one of their next conquests: water, fuel, everything, the whole place. What is Turkey going to think about that when Israel expands its borders all the way through Lebanon? I don't think they'll do it precipitately, but they will do it eventually. And the empire will be right there with them. That's the thing that truly bothers me about some of the leadership of this empire. They would have no objection whatsoever if Israel conquered the entire Levant and ruled it.
right now, what Turkey is doing in terms of the attacks that Israelis are implementing in Syria. Right now, they have been more than 350 attacks on Syria in the last 48 hours. They destroyed everything.
Yep.
They destroyed everything. But we've heard nothing from Turkey nor from these people, these jihadists in Syria.
No. Which makes me think that the rabbi this morning was even wronger than I thought he was, that Israel is complicit with every player, not just, you know, the United States, but complicit with everyone. Doing even Jelani.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Larry, for being with us today.
Surely.
Great pleasure as always.
Not a pleasure, the subjects we talk about, a pleasure to talk to you, though.
Exactly.
There a little bit about South Korea. Is it your understanding that American intelligence was involved and hoped to exploit the presidential declaration of martial law in South Korea recently, as a result of which the former defense minister, has been arrested and attempted suicide in prison, and the president has been restrained from leaving the country?
Well, that's the unconfirmed rumor that's very widespread inside Korea. And of course, we've had a presence in that country now for 70 years. And we certainly have a very large and effective intelligence network on the peninsula. So what happened could not have been a secret in Washington. There's no doubt that our government was aware of what was going on. And it seems reasonable to assume, as they have in the past, that the CIA would work to support the people in power. And the people in power are those that have historically supported whatever the United States wants in terms of foreign and defense policy.
And the opposition party to the president
Yeah.
does not support what American defense and intelligence want. Am I correct?
Oh, absolutely. These are the so-called liberal nationalists. We usually try to tar them as socialists or leftists, and that's not really accurate. They are simply people who they want a liberal society, but they're nationalists. And since the mid to late 1990s, they have been trying to persuade us to give them control of their troops on the Korean Peninsula. And that would involve replacing the U.S. Army 4-star on the peninsula, who commands all forces. This is a legacy of the United Nations presence in Korea during the Korean War. This Army 4-star commands everything on the peninsula. And the Koreans in the Liberal Nationalist Party have wanted to change that, because their argument is, how do we pretend to be a truly sovereign state with its own independent national policy as long as we are subservient to the United States military and are therefore viewed in Asia as a military colony of the United States. And so they want that Korean 4-star to replace the Army 4-star. We have dug in our heels and tried to, as politely as possible, obstruct that change.
The attitude of the Liberal Party, I know they have a different name, but I'll use that as a handle so the audience know what I'm talking about, might find some sympathy in the ears of Donald Trump.
Well, initially, I think they thought they would, but enough effort was undertaken to obfuscate, confuse, and make the situation opaque that President Trump moved on to other things. Remember, the South Korean president is one of those individuals who plays a major role in terms of working with Beijing as well as with Tokyo, right, and ultimately also with North Korea. He had a role to play in this effort that we had underway to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula. And you'll remember that Messrs. Bolton and Pompeo were instrumental at the last minute in persuading Donald Trump not to sign the denuclearization agreement, because that would lead inevitably over a 5-year period to reductions in the U.S. military presence and ultimately our departure from the peninsula. Now, that's what the liberal nationalists wanted then. I'm sure they probably want it even more now, because frankly, from the standpoint of North Korea, if there is no American military presence in South Korea, there's no rationale for the existence of the North Korean state, because there's no enemy to the south.
Right.
We have not allowed that to happen. Now we've seen that these people who have worked tirelessly in support of whatever we want, these are the so-called Concord. They've had different kinds of names over the years. They're called conservatives, but they're really lackeys of the United States. And many of them, interestingly enough, have parents and grandparents who were lackeys of the Japanese back during the Japanese occupation. So it's a strange sort of set of circumstances, but they want to stay where they are as the permanent sort of cuddled puppy of America. But the majority of Korean people don't want that. And I think the liberal nationalists are now going to come roaring back into power. And that's why the coup occurred, because the president knew that his party, the conservatives, had no chance whatsoever of winning another election. They have disappointed the Korean people consistently. And one of the more obvious disappointments was standing up and perpetrating the lie that North Koreans were fighting on the ground in Ukraine when they aren't, and then suggesting that therefore South Korean troops should go to Europe to fight as part of NATO. They don't want anything to do with NATO. These people live in Asia, and they don't want to be part of any of the wars that we start or have to fight.
Boy, I don't think this looks good under the Trump administration, given the folks with whom he has announced he plans to surround himself, who will ally themselves to the wishes of the American deep state and military establishment. Switching gears, Colonel, what role did the United States play, if any, in toppling President Assad of Syria?
I think we have to take credit for having played a very major role. We have had people on the ground working to remove Assad certainly since 2011. And we could go through this timeline, but the point to keep in mind is that we've done everything we could to support his removal, because that, of course, was the wish of the Israeli government. They were always anxious to remove Assad. and would do anything at all possible to remove him. Keep in mind, right now in Egypt and in Jordan, the other two Arab states that border Israel, other than Lebanon, we have what are effectively regarded in the Arab world as puppet governments that are essentially loyal to us. We buy them. In fact, this morning I discovered that a $900 million check from the U.S. Treasury just arrived this morning in Jordan. The Jordanian government will obviously be very grateful for that. We have been renegotiating the debt that Egypt has. In other words, we have bribed people in those places. We bribe people all over the world, but specifically in those places to keep them on side when it comes to Israel. Now, the Jordanians are in a tough spot because the Israelis can shut off their water supply. They're not anxious to end up like Gaza at this point. Egypt's a little different now, and the Egyptian population there is very angry. We should come back to that because what happens in Egypt is very important, and you could see something similar to what has happened in Syria happen in Egypt.
Here's the president of Syria, President Assad, before he was deposed. This is in 2017, saying very similar to what you said, that the United States does not want partners, it only wants puppets. The key part to what he says, this is about 60 seconds long, the key part to what he says, with which I suspect you'll agree, is at the very end. Chris, number 13.
The problem in the United States is about the whole political system. It's not about one person. Trump's election has proven again for us, again and again, that the president is only a performer. He's not the decision maker. He's part of different lobbies and the deep state, or the deep regime, as we can call it, who implement and dictate on the president what should he be doing. And the proof to what I'm saying, that Trump, after he became president, he swallowed most of the promises and the word that he was boosting during his campaign. He made 180 turn in nearly every promise. So why? Because the deep state wouldn't allow him to go in certain direction. That's why, for me, dealing with him as a person, it could be, but can that person deliver? No. In the United States, president cannot deliver. The whole state, the deep state only, is the one who can deliver. And this is the problem. This deep state doesn't accept partners around the world. They only accept puppets. They only accept followers. They only accept proxies. That's what they accept. We're not any of these.
What's up?
Hi, Jira. We brought you here today to let you know.
Gone, of course, but I think he had a good handle on the influence of the deep state in foreign affairs, don't you?
Well, he's repeating essentially what President Putin has said and others have said over the years. And in his case, he tried to evade becoming a puppet or being removed through the arrangements that the Russians, Iranians, and Turks made in Sochi and Astana. And these were agreements that were designed to essentially freeze the ceasefire after ISIS and its offspring and affiliates, al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, and so forth, had been defeated back in the teens. He thought this would last. Obviously, it didn't. It was never a perfect outcome because there was a Kurdish state emerging in the northeast of Syria, and the Turks had moved into and occupied a portion of northern Syria and then created, under Erdogan, this enclave of radical Islamists, essentially the survivors of ISIS, and nurtured them over the years and prepared them for what they're doing now. We've also done the same thing in the enclave that we control over on the border with Iraq. We've repurposed many of the same people, roughly 11,000 of them. And about 17, 18,000 more were under Erdogan. And of course, Mossad was involved with the CIA and MI6 in the equipping and training. But the principal job of coaching the Islamists collectively in how to do it and where to go and what to do is really President Erdogan.
The funding that the United States through the CIA and other intelligence services supplied, did it make its way to al-Jilani, who has a $10 million bounty on his head because he cuts the heads of other people off?
Well, I rather suspect so. And I don't think he's terribly worried about the bounty at this point because obviously we are his allies.
Right.
We are 100% aligned with them. And what you're seeing, and this is where we really ought to spend some time. People need to understand that we're watching something that we have not seen yet in the 21st century. We've seen it in the 20th century and earlier in European history, which is a formal partition of a third country by at least two other partners, maybe more, and that's Syria. It has an uncanny resemblance to the partitions of Poland in 1795 and the partitions of Poland later on again in 1939. Between 1795 and 1939, in both cases, the Polish state vanished and only came back later as a consequence of new powers emerging and demands made by the new winners of the Second World War. What we see in Syria is something similar. And we already know that the Israelis have forces on the outskirts of Damascus. And we know from the map that President Netanyahu held up in front of the UN when he spoke to it, showed effectively his Greater Israel plan. And the Greater Israel document includes the lower half of Syria, much of Jordan, and reaches all the way over into Egypt, as well as most of Lebanon. And this is very real now. 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, when things were going very, very badly in southern Lebanon, as well as in Gaza, people lost sight of this. But this has been cooking for some time. We have ultimately had a great deal to do with organizing this. And of course, Mr. Erdogan has made no secret of his Ottoman aspirations or ambitions. He's got maps floating around on Turkish television that show Greece and Bulgaria as part of Turkey, along with most of the Caucasus, parts of northern Iran, and most of Syria and most of northern Iraq. So these are two states with two leaders right now, Netanyahu and Erdogan, who are determined to realize their dreams. And we have simply said, go for it. The problem with all of this is you've unleashed a tiger, at least two tigers, and you don't know where this is all going to end up. And that's why people in Egypt are now very uneasy about the potential for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt to become another disciple of Erdogan in this great game. And we don't know what could possibly happen in Jordan and how long we will tolerate that state under anybody other than Israeli direction. And now, if you move to Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, they are genuinely fearful. And they're not probably going to want to bet very heavily on any guarantees that we give them. It's a very strange situation. It's something nobody expected to see. We have always listened to people with aspirations and show us maps with new territory, but now these aspirations are realities, and the realities are dangerous for the entire region and potentially, depending upon how the rest of the world acts, to the world.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu is being cross-examined in a criminal case in which he is the defendant accused of bribery in Tel Aviv. Is his IDF actually conquering, stealing land that 2 weeks ago was part of Syria?
Well, I don't think they have to conquer much. They launched a furious air campaign over the last 72 hours to destroy virtually everything that had any military value on the ground in Syria. And I think that was also part of the broader plan to pay off all of the senior officers in the Syrian army to back down and turn everything over to them. That was very successful in terms of destroying what was there. That doesn't mean, though, that the Islamist hordes that are running wild across Syria don't have other sources of equipment and ammunition. They do. It's called Turkey. And the Turkish military is moving cautiously behind them. The Turkish military intelligence officers are forward. They're seeing what's happening. They're reporting. And again, Erdogan is coaching. We think they're probably going to kill at least 100,000 people if they haven't already done it in Syria. But Erdogan has coached them and say, don't kill everybody. Avoid villages that are Christian, avoid certain areas. We don't want to awaken the West to what's happening. And ultimately, I think that'll be the end of the Christian community in Syria, and probably inevitably what's left of it in Iraq, unless the Shiites in Iraq can protect them as they have in the past. So it's a very grim situation, Judge.
The militant groups that you're referring to as Islamic hordes, they're hardly Zionists. I mean, might Israel have unleashed a tiger which would try to consume it?
No, I think that's true. And if you just take a step back and think back to 1939, Guderian, who commanded forces in Poland, was sent to the demarcation line to meet his Soviet counterpart, where they would agree to the final line of demarcation between Soviet and German interests in 1939. And he remarked in his diary and later confided to Hitler that he had an ominous feeling about the whole thing, because he said ultimately this border has been moved from its former position, that is the Soviet border, 300 miles further to the west. He was obviously worried in the future about a Soviet attack. Now I think the Israelis are looking at the ground. There's not much in southern Syria, frankly. It's mostly open desert once you get off the Golan. And there's really nothing much until you get to Damascus. And it's very obvious that Mr. Netanyahu wants to claim Damascus. Now, once that's done and this line is drawn, they will gradually realize, I think, in Israel, if they haven't already, that they have moved Turkish power, influence, military capability, subterfuge, you name it, much, much closer to Israel than it has ever been before. And the Turks are formidable. In other words, whatever we're seeing now that looks like a honeymoon between these two groups that both want hegemony, it's not likely to last, Judge.
Colonel, is there any moral or legal justification? Now, I suppose I could stop there and you'll say, Judge, the intelligence community, the deep state doesn't care about morality or law, but is there any moral or legal justification for American warplanes bombing military assets in Syria, the American government funding the terrorists, the jihadists that took over Syria? Is there even the remotest concern for American national security, or is all of this because of our obeisance to Israel?
Well, I think most of it is Israeli connected. There's no question about it. We have supported Israel, and for many good reasons over many decades. The idea of supporting Israel now in this larger land grab, that's another matter entirely. That always is fraught with problems, as we've seen in previous wars. That's why I don't think this is the end of something. I think this is the beginning of something very new that's ultimately going to come crashing down on all of us. Now, at the same time, America has always been very myopic about seeing its potential opponents or adversaries or enemies. We obsess over one. The Israelis demonized Iran and saw to it that Iran was the ultimate evil that had to be crushed. We have adopted that position. Well, let's assume that you're successful, and eventually this results in the destruction of Iran, that we and the Israelis, along with help from the Turks, because the Turks, of course, are also in Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan and Turkey regard themselves as two states in one nation. Azerbaijan borders Iran and has provided the Israelis with platforms, with support, with airfields from which they can strike Iran. And of course, the Israelis have conferred enormous advantages militarily with drones and other equipment on the Turks in Azerbaijan, who are trying to drive out what remains of Armenia from the Caucasus. I think we're going to see that play out too in the near future. That'll be a second front for Iran, and God knows what will happen to the Armenians in the Caucasus. But the point is that we're so focused on the destruction of Iran as the principal problem. And that's something I've never signed up for and don't agree with. It doesn't matter what I think or you think. We see that very, very myopically, to the point where we don't look at the peripheral consequences, the collateral damage. Just as we were anxious to destroy Germany and Japan until there was nothing left during the Second World War, woke up and discovered that we had consigned half of the world to communism, half of Europe and most of Asia. There was no thinking about the consequences of empowering Soviet military strength, which we did. And without us, the Soviets would have had an enormously difficult time prevailing against the Germans. So we don't think about those things. We're so busy focusing in one direction that the consequences that are there are simply ignored. And I think what's happening right now is there will be great consequences strategically in the region. And by the way, remember, this is not something that the Russians signed up for, but the Russians have never regarded their position in the Middle East, especially in Syria, as the vital strategic outpost for Russian influence. It isn't. There are other places that they can go and other places where they will be welcomed. So they're not going to fight to the bitter end for a place like Syria. They did everything they could, but clearly Assad was unable to reform, reorganize anything. He didn't have much money. We'd starved him of that. Once again, it's bully, sanction, and bomb. We've done plenty of that. So his fate was sealed once it became clear that Erdogan was willing to work closely with Israel, because Erdogan has his own agenda. And again, this is the problem. You empower an alliance like this, the Israeli-Turkish de facto alliance for hegemony in the region,
right?
And you end up with problems, with serious problems over which you have no control anymore.
I remember a line from JFK's inaugural address: "Foolish people have tried to gain power by riding the back of a tiger and have ended up inside." We'll see what happens. Colonel, we have to go, but I must tell you that we are just a few subscriptions away from 499,000. Our goal, of course, is 500,000 by Christmas. I'm
very happy, Judge. I would just like to make one final observation. I don't know whether or not everyone is aware of it, but the spokesperson in Moscow, this very striking lady who speaks beautifully, she announced today that all Russian citizens have been urged to leave the United States.
Terrifying. But the subscriptions that we've achieved have been in large measure because of you and your time and your extraordinary brilliance. Thank you, Colonel. Thanks for everything. We'll see you again soon.
So thank you, Judge.
Of course. Coming up later today at 2:00, Professor John Mearsheimer. At 3:00, Phil Giraldi, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom. Today is Thursday, December 12th, 2024. Our dear friend and colleague, Max Blumenthal, joins us now. Max, a pleasure. Thank you very much for the time that you always spend with us. What role did the United States play in toppling the Assad government in Syria?
Well, the main role the United States played was destroying the Syrian economy after financing and arming a dirty war with $1 out of every $13 in the CIA's black budget for about 7 or 8 years, if not a decade. And Trump kind of cut it off in 2017, 2018. Then the U.S. remained in northeastern Syria. In the words of Dana Stroul, now in the Biden administration, former member of the Syrian Study Group, because we were the owner of that land in order to starve the Syrian state, deprive it of its wheat fields, and to siphon off the oil from the Conoco oil fields to sell off on the black market.
If you want to lose cortisol belly with minimal effort, then you need to try this 28-day chair yoga challenge. Despite
basically controlled demolition of the Syrian state has taken place since 2011, 2012, and the U.S. was right behind it. Following the U.S. military occupation of Syria, the U.S. imposed the so-called Syria sanctions based on an intelligence deception spearheaded by the monarchy of Qatar, displaying atrocity propaganda in the halls of Congress in order to mobilize a vote to sanction the Syrian central bank and de-link Syria from the world economy, being able to trade in US dollars, causing a massive inflation crisis, impoverishing the majority of Syrians, weakening the Syrian morale, depriving them of the post-war boom that most populations enjoy. And it led us straight to this moment where these jihadist, Sunni supremacist bandits, all aligned with al-Qaeda, led by the former deputy head of ISIS, Mohammed al-Jolani, storm into Aleppo to a demoralized population and take over. And what was the first thing that they did when they got to Aleppo? Syria, before the dirty war, had 24-hour electricity. It had free universities that were providing education to people who came from poverty and giving them engineering degrees. Foreigners would come to Damascus to study Arabic. After the dirty war, people were getting 2 hours of electricity. Everyone was relying on generators. So with Turkish support, the rebranded al-Qaeda forces of HTS provide full electricity to everyone in Aleppo on day one with generators. That was their sort of Turkish takeover message is, hey, we destroyed your state, but if you just stand with us, even if you're Christian or you're a member of another minority group, you'll get the electricity, you'll get the things you've been missing for so long. And that's one reason why you're seeing crowds cheering in the streets now, even though Syria is rapidly being Libyanized.
I didn't realize the extent of the American sanctions and the harm that it caused, Max, and I truly appreciate your educating me on it. Tell us about the neocon mentality. Tell us about the reason for this.
Well, the reason for sanctioning Syria was to foment regime change, and it succeeded, and it punished the entire population regardless of their political views or how they related to the Assad government. According to research by the Venezuelan think tank Sures, spelled S-U-R-E-S, close to 1/3 of the entire global population is currently under US sanctions, which have disconnected them from the global economy to some degree and forced them into permanent poverty. And that's simply because their governments refuse to obey the dictates of Washington. But the Caesar sanctions imposed on Syria were so severe, so much more severe than sanctions that we see elsewhere, that Syria was under siege on so many levels. Okay, first of all, you have US troops in northeastern Syria, which is Syria's breadbasket. That's where the oil fields are. So 2 of the main sources of Syria's productive base were destroyed. Then you have Aleppo, which had been looted by the Turkish military and Turkish MIT intelligence services. The factories and the even medical warehouses had been looted and stolen and taken to Turkey during the dirty war by Turkish-backed jihadist forces. Then you have Idlib, a NATO protectorate controlled by Turkey, where Jolani and his goon squads were holed up, that carved out a major section of northwestern Syria right near the coastal heartland of Latakia, which is where the Alawite population is now being tormented and may soon be ethnically cleansed. And then you have the sanctions on Damascus, on the central bank, which make it impossible for Syria to trade in dollars, which deprive it of cash, make it impossible for them to pay their military. It's actually amazing that the Syrian state was able to hold on this long. And now, if you look behind the headlines and look behind the executions that are taking place in public squares in Syrian cities, you'll see that the new putschist Sunni supremacist government that has taken power in Damascus is selling off Syrian state assets in a fire sale. It's a lot like Russia in the 1990s, where the state is being looted and just being sold off to the highest bidder, which could even be BlackRock.
Was President Assad at some point in his career, along with his intelligence services, a CIA asset?
He was not a CIA asset, but basically the Syrian government and also to some extent the Iraqi government of Saddam Hussein and a lot of governments in the Middle East after 9/11 said, wow, the US just got attacked by Al Qaeda. These are the same lunatics, the Egyptian government for sure, that have been killing our own people, that have been bombing our own cities, that are determined to overthrow us. Now the United States is going to get it, and they're going to finally help us to purge these forces. And so Syria, along with all the other post-colonial Arab governments, worked with the United States, including the CIA, on these rendition programs. And they would render suspects, the CIA would render suspects to Syria, but also to Poland. I mean, they would render them to NATO states.
The rendition program was horrific and disgusting.
Yeah, and they would torture suspects.
Unconstitutional and criminal.
Absolutely, and some of them were unfairly accused. But that was why they did it. And then in the end, by 2006, after Syria had done that, they also actually quietly joined the first Gulf War coalition. Syria was always seeking some kind of olive branch with the West to prevent its own destruction. By 2006, neocons in Congress, like the Cuban-American Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, had introduced the Syria Accountability Act. Basically, the Israel lobby wrote this legislation to begin sanctioning the Syrian state. And at the same time, Nancy Pelosi and John Kerry were making visits to Damascus, pushing Bashar al-Assad to introduce reforms. And the reforms were incoming. There were reforms happening across the board, political reforms, economic reforms. And then the Syrian dirty war begins, and that goes off the table. Syria is placed under total siege again, and becomes a much more repressive state.
Is the Israeli Hezbollah ceasefire now recognized as a fraud, as a facade, in order to divert Israeli assets and attention to eliminating Assad?
Just let's go back and watch Netanyahu's speech announcing the ceasefire when he said he issued a blunt warning to Syria and said he would attack Syria if they participated in any resistance-related activities, while declaring that he was going to now turn his attention to Iran.